Yeah.
So we'll just start in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
All right. Minutes. I should run audio. That thing is.
There's that,
That will be-
that's the
yeah.
microphone.
Okay.
We should mute and remove the microphone. It will be both things.
Yeah, so I'll be right back.
See.
Yeah, it's like handmade.
Such a healthy people today.
That's the only thing that I can make from there. When we were talking about scheduling. And then talking about that's different techniques to isolate tasks.
So, Joseph, is it a view from your office?
No. That is a bit fabricated, but it's not too far. This is the new residential academic center that they built. A couple of years ago. And then we just put up a brand new CS building that's just a couple blocks down from here. So my office space is south of it. Great use of making sure it's- I'm just happy to have a window.
Every state has to give rooms, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, we just moved into the building this year. But up until that, all my offices and my labs, all zero windows.
Cool.
Grateful for what I got. It's like weird, I get like warmed by the sun now.
Well, that note, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Joe Michaelis, our speaker for today. He's at UIC and has a joint appointment in computer science and learning sciences. His PhD is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's going to talk to us today about all his great work in social robotics.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's really interesting. UIC has this really unique relationship with our Learning Science and Research Institute and three of the colleges on our campus. And our RDC has really cool to see a place that have that close relationship. So it's part of why I was excited to come and give a talk to you all. I sometimes feel like it's hard to speak to any one of the sides of what I do. So when I find people who understand in the middle, it's really unique. So I appreciate that. So what I'm going to talk about is really me trying to muse about all these little things I've seen collect over time that have shown me what's happening with mental models of how people see the robots, see themselves, see the activities. It really shapes what they do. And I haven't been able to totally fully put together. So the idea here is to think about how this intersection between the way people in learning sciences and robot interaction think about mental models. What's the intersection there? And I'm going to just show you a little bit of early insights into what I saw emerging that is indicative of mental models for particularly kids that's led me down this path a bit. Give you some theoretical perspective. This is the part where some rock throwing might happen. If you disagree with me, I totally am okay with that and would love to be persuaded otherwise on some of these things. Because I'm still grappling with how to put this together. Talk a little bit more about more contemporary work of mine on how these mental models might be forming. And I'm going to give you a very rickety, but still sort of framing of how we might think about this intersection. And then some of the takeaways and next steps that I've been thinking about. So generally for the last 10 years or so, I've really been just fascinated by what happens when you have a person and a robot and an activity in this space and how this unfolds. I think about them a lot in terms of educational kind of activities, but I just think the idea about this shared activity space is so unique with this emerging technology. And so I really want to think about how do we design with people's perspectives in mind here, with considerations for like location, where this is happening, and all of this builds up, I think, into helping describe for people what it is that they do, and then what it is that the robot's supposed to do. So we can think about these as this sort of mental model I'm going to talk about as a simulation of what's happening in front of a person. And I focus on three major factors that contribute to that. Context cues from the activity itself, from the environment, and then one of the ones I focus most on is the social cues that come from the robot. And I think that these are really major, clearly not the only ones, but major components of what goes into mental model formation in these scenarios. And I think it really defines a lot for people what their own role is, what the robot's role is, and what should happen in this activity. So some of the early insights, and this is some of my earliest work in HRI that's really stuck with me over time, is how people sort of see this relationship. So this is as basic as it gets of a robot interaction. You can tell this is technically a field deployment. It's held together by some electrical tape because we were just barely hanging on with the prototype at the time. And this is a pretty dumb robot. So as kids read, they scan the page when they get to a little tag, the robot says something to them. But I want you just to get a sense for what that looks like. Oh, I didn't test it.
You have to show the sound.
Rested on my laurels here. This will go really badly.
You show it from a game and choosing, yeah, show the sound.
Let's try that.
No way, Duke says. I'm staying here until I beat this dumb game. Well, I'm not. I get up and kick his baseball glove out of the way. Time for you to go to camp. No way, Gig says. I'm staying here until I beat this dumb game. Well, I'm not. I get up and kick his baseball glove out of the way. He promised you to go to camp. We all did. You can't back out now. Gig doesn't even look up.
Wow.
That might be the GMI.
Upset about not wanting to go to soccer camp with his friends.
Okay. But yeah, poke around and try to get this and I'll keep talking. I'm just connected.
Oh, you're just sharing on Zoom.
Just disconnected the cable.
I think that the projector turned on.
Projector's turned
Yeah, I think it might be overheating, so
Of course, we're still there.
press on.
There should be
We
an
need
on.
to give it time. I think it's overheating.
It's
Great, okay, cool. So, hopefully that came through. We got a whole bunch of other ones, so. But what I want to point out is in this interaction, one of the things that really stood out to me is that we didn't have to tell kids how to do this. When they scanned that thing and the robot spoke to them, they stopped and they listened. And one of the things they said to us a lot was they felt this was great because it gave them time to sort of think and reflect themselves, absorb what the robot was saying. So even in this really simple interactions, there was this powerful effect for kids. And then the other side is routinely telling us they love this companionship. It felt like someone was there listening to them, taking part in this thing. And if you just listen to the way that the kid is speaking, they sound bored. But when we talk to them, they're very excited to have that. So really thinking about this from a bigger frame than just one small angle and thinking big picture about how their mental model is shaping. So one of the other things that's happened in our field work is the role of the environment that took place in some of these interactions. So in this case, you're going to see a social cue from the robot here influence the kid's behavior. The robot says, the kid's going to try to stop reading. The robot's like, hey, we didn't meet our goal. But the environmental part is over there in the bottom corner, you can kind of see a toe. That's this kid's brother. And so I want you to see what happens when this interaction unfolds. It's amazing doing stuff in people's homes and in the wild, like all kinds of beautiful things. So this is initially the kid's going to say, I don't want to read anymore. We did this with RFID cards.
You haven't achieved your time goal yet. You still have 5 minutes of reading. Should we continue reading? B. You can scan any book you want to read. You might like to try one of these 3 books. Number 1, Ramona Cooney, age 8. Number 2, Night of the Living Dummy. Number 3, Encyclopedia Brown.
Slappy's back. Cool for Slappy.
All right. Great. Let's read Night of the Living Dummy.
We have this little algorithm in there. We took some interest survey from the kids, and the robot would suggest books that should match that kind of interest profile. But in this case, the kid doesn't pick that book. She picks this Night of the Living Dummy. When we interviewed the kid later about this, the reason she did is because her little brother is terrified of those books. She was rubbing it in his face. And you could hear her little brother be like, oh, cool for Slappy, like, So you have this social influence from the robot that's happening, but this environmental interaction is really shaping on what the kid thinks they're going to do. So we move this, I want to say, okay, best case scenario, let's try to think about my zone, right? I was a science teacher, 6th grade, high school. I actually worked with this almost the same exact textbook. One of the things I noticed there is that when you ask a kid to do a reading in that textbook, they would blow past things like the little extra activities and stuff in there. Really wanted them to do that. So I said, well, let's have the robot. This is kind of part of the whole bigger part. Let's have the robot just say, oh, there's a discovery activity. Let's do that. So I want you to see what I noticed, though, what happened when this activity happened. I got some of what I wanted and some of what I didn't. And I think that's important.
Other activity on the top of this page. Let's do it together. After you finish the activity, press the green button.
Which lands first? Stack 3 quarters. Place them between the quarters to hold. Stack the 3 quarters and hold them tightly together. Then place the stack of the quarters next to a single quarter near the edge of a desk.
Look, you can see they're shifting in case of the materials.
Put a
text.
roller flat on the desk beside the coins. Line it up parallel to the edge of the desk and just touching the coins.
So at no point is the robot usually involved in what's happening.
Keeping the roller parallel to the edge of the desk, push the coins over on the edge at the same time. Observe how long the coins take to land.
Watch yours. Lines up. Lines up. That's one of those, am I doing it right books? You can't do it, not the way.
Predicting. Did you see a difference in the time the coins took to fall? Use what you observed to predict whether the soccer ball will fall more quickly than a marble. Will the pencil fall more quickly than a book? How can you test your predictions?
That's interesting. I thought the big stack of quarters would fall faster, but they looked like they hit the ground at the same time. I wonder why.
What happens when you jump on a sled on the side of a snow-covered hill without actually doing?
So I think there's a ton happening here. Primarily, the influence of having the robot getting them to do the activity, that worked. The robot said, let's do that together. And that influence seemed to matter in a lot of these interactions. But when it got to here, where there's the activity materials and the instructions in the text, the robot didn't seem to be a source of the information. They just knew there goes in the text and they needed to do this thing. And when they were a little unsure, they looked up at the researcher room, me, as like, am I doing this right sort of thing, not the robot. So I think it's really telling about where their mental model is about how to do this part. And when the robot asks questions, kids respond. When the text asks questions, they didn't. And that was, again, really telling about what it is that we're doing. If it had been more clear or had some sort of way that the robot acknowledged answers of questions in the book, maybe that would have shaped and changed what they did a little bit differently. But at the end, they're still following along. They go back to the robot, they press the green button. And this is what I wanted. I wanted the robot to frame, because a lot of these things, kids don't see what you want them to see. They see what they kind of expect. So we have the robot kind of clarify what the robot saw. And you can see the kid glances over at the materials and is starting to integrate some of what the robot's saying into what their experience does. So a lot of mental model things that are happening, where some of them are kind of missing, some of them are missing. And these sort of episodes just stuck with me. So I've been really trying to parse, like, how do we build the theory in HRI, theory in learning sciences that thinks about mental models and integrate those in ways that's going to help try to describe what's happening. So let's start at mental models. This comes from the Mental Models Global Laboratory. There's 100 and some odd researchers around the world who are part of this group. And they publish and think deeply about mental models. So I borrowed their definition of simulation of the world. Right? Mind constructs when we think and reason. And I don't mean that in some sort of like abstract sense, but simulations as in like a neurological, body-based simulation of these things. And importantly, those simulations, we think we can act on the content of those and use them to make predictions and reason. So this actually comes from the Mental Models Global Laboratory website. They sort of put it out there without much discussion, but I think it really illustrates some of what's happening in the mind. So if I ask you to explain how this scene came to be, how could you explain how we got here? What would have had to take place? I think. Go ahead.
The image that was like this and it was full.
Okay, we're gonna add on that.
I think somebody has been watching Inception.
So yes, probably, likely. But I'm going to go with your answer because you fell into the trap I wanted you to fall into. What I think is happening here that many people explain is that our minds, our experience with reality is that this should have been kind of a flat scene. And the only way to get from what we would expect it to be here is to do something like this. Well, in doing this, you are hinting at what's happening in the mental model. You are acting on that mental model. that simulation of doing that. So there was a whole rabbit hole we were going to go down. My training is in embodied cognition. I studied with Michigan in Wisconsin. And they would describe this in this idea of gesture as a simulated action model. And essentially, at some point, the mental imagery that we have and we start to act upon it, we hit this activation threshold where it just comes out through our bodies. And you can lower and raise that threshold, and there's a lot of parts of it. But my point is, particularly when we're doing these gestures, it can be a real window into the mental model that's underlying. And it really demonstrates how these things fall into this kind of definition. So I'm going to resist the urge to go down that rabbit hole, but that's kind of how I think about the way mental models are. In HRI, they think about these in a lot of ways that I really like this framing, particularly because there's often this idea about this task in between that I find really important. So we, as people, interact with robots in a way that we can think of as a model of how that interaction can go. And it's informed by what the robot's like, what the task is like, the robot's actions are one action. In HRI, they're often thinking about the robot perspective on this in a way that we can try to model what the human is thinking. And I go to like HRI conferences and I sign up for these workshops about like theory of mind. And I'm like, yes, oh, wait, you're talking about robots, great. And it's important that we can do this. We can try to model what other people are thinking. And the idea is that if we treat them almost like a state machine, we can estimate their state and then predict their next state, the robot can meet them there and their actions go on. But I'm much more interested in the person side of this thing. What are those mental models people have of the robot that kind of work in the same way? And again, I really want to emphasize it has a lot to do with the robot itself, but the contextual factors really matter. So we're going to play a little game. I hate this as an audience member, but I subject my audience to it. I'm in charge. So how do these robots function and what roles do they take? Ready? This robot. What does it do? What role does it have? How does it work?
Just mentioned like telepathy, or not remote in precision surgery.
Position for surgery kind of thing. And teleoperated, is that what you're going on?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it can be teleoperated or surgeon could be in the same room.
Okay, cool. Your gesture went like this. That's right at the teleoperator, right? Is this the controller
Yeah.
in your hand? Right. Okay, great. Any other interpretations of what this robot does, how it does it? What if I gave you a little more context? That'll help.
Is it the same role?
Same robot, yep. It has an actuator, an effector on there that's a little bit different.
Scanning for something?
It's scanning for something. Yeah, you can kind of see that. Maybe you don't quite get it. This is actually a sanding device. So these are woodworking pieces. The robot's here to kind of help this person in finishing this wood piece.
Oh,
Right.
The precision robot here and multi-purpose, of course, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so, but you'll note that it doesn't have like a big cage around it, right? So it's meant to have people around it. It's right there, ready to go. You can kind of see how it's going to connect with the person. Often with these robots, when I ask people to think about them, the teleop was a new one because we think this way. Often people do this, right? And it's because they have this sort of arm-like relationship, but it's not the same joints. And that comes out in our gestures that we're representing it a little bit differently than it does. Okay, how about this robot? What does it do? What kind of roles does it take? Is Pepper a pretty famous robot? Receptionist, okay, great. Yeah, so if we give you a little more context, can you give me more details? Bringing people in, yeah. And that's one of the things that's telling for me is particularly this gesture, right? What if the gesture was like this? Right? Is this telling you to come into the store? This is telling you to stay out of my store. And so you can get these cues, but you really get all these rich details about the context that you see that really helps fill in the way you understand what's happening. Okay, another robot. This is Jibo, the ill-fated Jibo. It was our hope. We thought Jibo was going to be the commercially successful robot we all wanted, but it came out at a $900 price point at the same time that Alexa did at $100, and people were like, why would I get this thing when it's just an Alexa that thinks at me? And we left a very interesting legacy. But what does this robot do? What's its roles? How does it work?
Like an assistant?
Kind of like an assistant? Yeah. What kind of expectations do you have for it? How would you interact with it? What if I give you a little more context? What happened here? What kind of role does the robot have now? What would happen if you press that start button? You think it's gonna happen?
Proctoring an exam.
Could be, right? And so, but that tells me you have a little bit more of a formal idea about this robot, right? It's a proctor, right? But it very well could be a game that might happen, and that would be different than proctor, right? So this little context does tell you that there's some activity happening over here. When you press the start button, what would you expect from the robot?
Say something.
Say something, welcome, right? It's probably not just going to stay static, right? We have this expectation that we understand these things. Okay, I'm going to give you my last one. This is my favorite. The worst picture, but the best payoff. What is this robot? What does it do?
Delivery of the medicine in the hospital.
Okay, that's actually probably the most well thought out guess I've had in a while. Let me give you a little context. Does a robot do what's it well here?
I think take leaves.
Okay. There's a little kid here. I want you to see what the kid thinks the robot is there for. Did any of you guess hugging? That this robot's here for hugging. Is that what you? Also, not a robot. It's a broken down water heater.
Yeah, that's
But that's the thing. That's all it takes, right? A couple of eye sort of things on a facey kind of thing, on a tall and not as wide thing. It's anthropomorphism just flows out of this kid so much that they're there to hug them. So my point is that when you build these mental models, we don't even need that much information for us to start to project and to think these things and start to figure out what's happening here. And the more information you gather, the more details you can add into there and refine that model. So the mental model of others, and HRI really loves this theory of mind framing, where we're simulating other people's thoughts and behavior, and particularly, again, not just abstractly, but in our own nervous system. So I'll save you the mirror neuron speech, but that's, I think, what is actually happening here, that we see robots, we most readily apply models that we know the most intimately. And that one is almost always people. We know people, we know social behaviors, so we project them when we can to try to map what the world is doing out there. So in this theory of mind model, we get these mental states are informed by the shared world knowledge. This is what comes from the theory, and this is that activity and context bit of the HRI model I was talking about. The social cues that we get, again, that robot gave no social cues other than just being kind of like docile, and then the interpretation of actions that happens around. All of these things go in to contribute what it is that we're thinking is happening. Okay. The next bit that I really try to do to help understand these mental models is the way that we think about these concepts and problems. And I draw on knowledge construction as this learning sciences theory to help explain what's happening here. And in this case, we think about it, again, in the sort of learning perspective of trying to understand and grapple with concepts and activities that we're doing. And from the knowledge construction perspective, is where we integrate our own prior knowledge, some new information, and then others' beliefs and knowledge. That happens within this mental simulation as well. And the idea here is that by constructing it, people are introducing their own knowledge, their own opinions, and then they're building and integrating those ideas and perspectives of other people, particularly when you get to the highest interactive levels of this stuff. This is where we're actually willing to take ideas of others into account. And there's sort of two levels. A more cognitive level just thinks about externalizing and internalizing. And I think I get at this with some of the robot stuff that I've been doing. So when you hear from somebody else, you have to sort of grapple with what they're saying and integrate it within your own understanding. And that can be really beneficial for your knowledge and understanding yourself. And then same thing for externalizing. You have to do that work to summarize and synthesize what you think, to package it in a way that somebody else can understand. And that can be really beneficial for your understanding. Well, the collective knowledge construction folks, so I really rely on Cress and Kimberly's framing of this. They really think that what the magic is when you're uptaking other people's ideas and you're building on them, not just I throw out my ideas, you throw out your ideas. Day, you actually build those up. That's the challenge that I'm trying to hit with robots. And it's rare that we get people's mental models to get to this part, but I'm trying, that's what I want. But the last part, this is the sort of frontier for me, is to think about a model that adds in that task within this simulation space. So there's some kind of work that thinks about this object-oriented collaboration. And it now thinks of knowledge formation in a trialogical way. So our learning and our cultural activity are trialogical. It's multiple people, but also the objects and the activities that take place in between. You could go full constructionist on this and really say that it is the actual physical things, but I think you can have some epistemic objects that work here in this as well. And you can see we've kind of come full circle back to the HRI explanation, where we have people, task, robot, the activities that they do around that task, and then the way that they think each other are operating and understanding each other. So that's kind of the theory I've been putting into making sense of what I've been seeing. I want to share a little bit more then about how I see these mental models being formed. Okay with that? Nobody threw anything. All right, so I told you it came from Mitch Nathan's lab in Wisconsin, and he does a lot of this work on gesture and learning. And one of the big takeaways I had from a project I worked on in graduate school was where we designed this study to bring in students, and we projected a mathematical conjecture for them up on a board. And we had them say if that conjecture is true or false, and why they believed it. So what we found was that when people started doing these depictive gestures while they were reasoning, that was associated with better ability to make a quality proof about why it was true or false. And it also helped their insights and intuitions about just sort of knee-jerk, is this right? And so those gestures really added to their ability to do these things beyond just spoken language. So there's benefits to doing these things, which I was fascinated by and loved. But one of the things that really struck me about this study was the design. So we stood them up and had them stand by these boards. And then we had a researcher in the room, and they were instructed their reasoning, they should explain their reasoning to that researcher. And the whole point was to try to induce more gesture on it. So I've always kind of had this idea of like, well, there's this real social nature of that gesture threshold that I introduced a little bit earlier. And so, well, robots can do that too. Robots bring socialness to this experience. So I wonder what that's like. So early in my faculty career, I'm trying to figure out, my God, what am I going to do here? I said, what if I had a robot do it? So we got this robot to do the exact same reasoning activities that we did with Mitch. The robot did in one condition beat gestures along with those things, which were not associated with any sort of learning games in the earlier studies. And in another condition, they would do these beneficial gestures, which had done some other work where they identified, in this case, it's reasoning about a triangle. What are some beneficial gestures that really help reason about things? So we had mostly undergrads sit with the robot. The robot would do 4 conjectures itself, say if it's true or false, reason about those things. And then the student took a turn. They would get 4 conjectures, and they reasoned about that. And what happened was, when you were in a condition with the robot doing these dynamic gestures instead of beat gestures, dynamic gesture condition folks used more gestures themselves when they reasoned. It was pretty overwhelming. The people in the beat condition barely used any gestures at all. Dynamic gesturing, they used a lot. They looked more at the robot. They felt the robot was a better study partner. But interestingly, they weren't any more successful in correctly reasoning about the geometry conjecture. So they didn't get the benefit that was hypothesized in there, but they did actually do those gestures. The takeaway for me on this one was that the robot seemed to convey this understanding that it was able to interact at a level of sophistication capable of creating and manipulating those mental simulations. So by the robot doing its gestures, it sort of subconsciously communicated to the person that those gestures were appropriate. This is what we're doing. So it didn't benefit them directly here, but it did induce the gestures in ways that folks in body cognition say we don't. So then, what do we do in HRI? Well, what happens if the robot is simulated? So again, in this case, the social presence of the robot was saying it just did very different versions of how it acted. Well, I want to manipulate the social presence of the robot itself. So in HRI, what we'll do is put that robot on a screen, And by having the robot not in person anymore, we lose some of that sociality. So in this case, all beneficial dynamic gestures in both cases, it was just simply the difference of whether it was on a screen or not. We wanted to see what would happen here. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of what that looked like. Now, in the robot's turn, the reason about a conjecture, we did the audio was exactly the same. We went so far as actually to take the in-person robot, we dragged that out in the hall, ran a big cable, you can see there's a speaker back here, so that you got the exact actual audio from the robot, the exact same in both conditions. So what I'm going to do is play the robot audio, and you can see both participants at the same time. This is the first time they hear a robot reason about this conjecture.
The area of a parallelogram is the same as the area of a rectangle with the same base.
Just to clarify, in case you can't see, this person's in the control condition. There's a screen right here, and you can see the robot's hand. That's it.
And width. Okay, this is tricky. Let me think about it. If I have a rectangle, I can tilt the vertical sides of the rectangle to make a parallelogram. Okay, I think the area does not change, because it was like shifting the size to make a parallelogram, and placing it on the other side to make a rectangle. So yes, I think this theorem is right.
So you can see in the
If one
first, on the left, in person, they have a little bit more attention to what the robot is doing. Person in the control condition is attending to the robot some, but you can see them glance back at the screen. What I found was really interesting is that when this effect happened, it degraded over time. So by the time the robot did the fourth one, I'm going to show you that here, those visual patterns.
the triangle is larger than the second angle, then the side opposite first angle is longer than the side opposite the second angle. Wow, this is hard to prove, but I can do it. Let me think. If I have a large angle, I need the opposite side of this large angle to be long enough to close it. And if I have a small angle, I still need the opposite side long enough to close the angle. But this angle is small, so the opposite side is short. While for the large angle, the side would be longer. So yes, I was right. As an angle on a triangle opens up and becomes larger, the opposite side becomes larger.
So you can see in this case, she's almost entirely looking at the text here. Early on, the person on the left there was looking at the text, and then when the robot started to gesture, it became more like, so yeah.
Is it what you show to this right person is the video of the same robot remotely, the same kind of or just simulated robot like picture on the screen? That's a really big difference because robot really moving robot is a novelty. You're going to look at that. Picture on the screen is not a novelty by far. There's no point to look at that so much. So
Yes.
But of course, if you show a picture of real robot moving, it's still interesting, although the robot is not here.
Oh, I see. If it was like a video of the
Yeah, same
actual
robot.
study,
You say that it's a real voice of the real
Yeah.
robot in a different room. Well, you can just show the camera too.
Yeah, you're right. And so the studies that have done all three of those do find that there is that cascading effect. That this is the furthest social presence of it. So we went with this because that was kind of the lever we were trying to push. We wanted to remove the social presence, but display the exact same things. And again, it was the visual part that we wanted to abstract, not the audio. So that's why we.
Right, but there's actually an issue with believability. To what extent it really exists and real? Well, if you have to show a video of a real thing, it is believable. So that's a really big difference psychologically.
Yes, and I think that's the dynamic that is what's happening here is that the visual information, it's the same information, but because it feels so socially abstracted, right? This isn't a real robot. It becomes less salient. And so they're starting to rely more on the text for the information and not the gestures for that.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what we're trying to tease out apart here. One of the interesting things, though, is in the first study, that impacted the amount of gesturing people did, right? The different types of gestures. This social abstraction didn't seem to impact the gesture rate for either condition.
Area of a parallel.
Just the control condition person. This is what often took place when they started.
Sum of the length of two sides of a triangle is always greater than the length of the third side. What do you think about it?
Yeah, okay. I think that this is true. This is true because basically if it wasn't true, so that all the three sides they wouldn't make like a closed structure, but it would remain open. So I think that in order to make the proper shape of a triangle, in order to be closed, and that each side.
So I'll go through a little bit, but what you're seeing is that they're giving these social glances to the robot in the ways that we do when we're trying to make sure somebody's following along. The gestures, though, don't seem to be for the robot. They're not like projecting them out. And in the in-person studies I did with Mitch, we would get a mixture of both. Some people would do these gestures where they're just sort of in their own head with it. Some people would do the gestures for the benefit of the research. Like, well, yeah, so if we do the angle like this. In these cases, it was rarely for the benefit of the robot. Didn't matter the condition. It was mostly for their own benefit. They had this sort of closed space on it. They referred to the text a lot in the reasoning. When they did glance at the robot, they were doing that in sort of like, are you following along? Sort of. So again, sort of portraying for me the mental model of what needs to happen in order to interact with this robot to make this activity. All right. So the takeaways there was that in the in-person condition, we didn't notice any actual differences in their gesturing or their ability to solve these problems, but they felt they were more effective when the robot was in person. They felt more companionship, and that's kind of the manipulation. And they also felt that the robot supported their reasoning and comprehension. So the effect was there, it just didn't manifest in the behaviors we thought. But one big thing that came out of this was related to stuff kids have been telling me for years up to this, is that the robot just didn't judge them, and they loved that. And this happened here too. And so even the adults really sort of appreciated that the robot didn't judge what they were doing. And in this case, we got a good slice of the evidence of where that came from. So I could not pull up a video of it, so I'm going to have to reenact. A brilliant master's student that worked on this project, and she came up with a program design for one of the conjectures. In fact, you can see this shape here. One of the conjectures that the robot does is about the area of a rectangle. If you double the length and double the height of a rectangle, it doubles the area. And if you're not paying attention, a lot of people will say, yeah, that's true. And so the robot, we programmed to do that. The robot said, yeah, that's true. If I double the length and double the height, and I'm telling you, she nailed this interaction. She has the robot look down at its hand and go, oh, wait, that can't be right. And then reasons that out. That episode was really impactful for people. So one of our participants told us they feel comfortable trying to solve the problems and that the robot was more helpful, making me feel less stupid. We said, why? They went back to that episode. They said, well, the robot made a mistake. It corrected its mistake as it thought through it. So that was the time I think when I liked the robot the best. Because I was thinking, and this was one of the beautiful things that happened. The robot was like sitting there during this interview, and when they were talking about the robot, they look at the robot, they talk to the robot. So in this case, they looked over at the robot and they're remembering it making a mistake, and they're like, yeah, when you did that, no, man, that's not double the area. Looked back at us and said, and I was thinking the robot was wrong. And then watching it figure it out was really cute and felt personal. And that set them at ease. It was okay to make mistakes here. So we reshaped what's expected, what we can do, simply by having the robot sort of demonstrate that as part of what's happening. If the robot had been perfect on these things, it may have conveyed a different message. Okay, we got there. I'm going to transition a little bit. So I see a lot of this mental model formation. One of the things I've really been sensitive to is if I want to get these robots into classrooms, I want them to be able to tailor to the classroom, and I want to empower teachers to be able to do that. So we've designed over the last couple of years this authoring tool for teachers to make their own robot-assisted reading magazines. So they can upload a PDF, and then they can create comments. They just drag a little comment bubble out onto the screen here, write whatever they want to say. And they can even kind of test it out, change the robot's emotions. And I really felt that this was something that could very much allow teachers to shape these lessons specifically for their own classrooms and their student needs. And they told us all the time they wanted automation. We co-designed like 4 rounds of teacher co-design activities. And I think I have, I'm not going to show you the way I'm doing it on Zoom. But the way we automated it is that you can highlight any of the text in here, hit the little magic button over there, and we have a generative AI script that will generate for you some things that the robot might say. So that summary that's over there, that summary and emotional connection, those are both AI generated responses that the robot might say. And so the teachers kept saying, automate, automate, automate. We said, okay, great, we did it. And they didn't use it. We found that on average about each of the teachers in our study used about 1.5 of the AI generated ones, and most often they created their own comments. But when we looked back at the table,
What would you say again? They not using AI comments, but they created own comments? Or what's
correct, yeah, right. So if you're in this system here, you can drag and create your own and just write whatever you want. We have a couple of suggestions that these are, we call them the suggested general. And those are things like, hey, can you explain that to me that were really broadly applicable? They use those more often even than the AI generators. They almost always generated some of these things, but they didn't use them that much. Yeah.
So in not using it, was it like a whole sequence where they started to see what was being generated, they praised it and said, "Ooh, that's not what I would say." So therefore they started creating their own? Were they just like, it's good to bring automation, it's a good option, I don't know what you said.
No, more the former, more the first thing. So what actually happened a lot of times is they would create them and they'd be like, oh, that's a good idea. And they'd rewrite it in the way that makes sense for their classroom. And a lot of times they preserve their own voice. That's what really stood out, is teachers like that they get to keep their voice by creating these things and do things the way that their students would expect, that their students understand. And they talked a lot about, like sort of local cultural stuff where, students would understand a reference to a lake here, not an ocean, that kind of thing. So what ended up happening is they were almost inspired by the opportunities and the options that the generated ones showed them. But these were very experienced teachers as well. So they were just like, well, I knew what I wanted to say, so I just do it. And we also demonstrated in this paper that the efficiency wasn't actually all that more efficient because they kept kind of messing and nudging with the AI. They rarely ever just took them stock right off the shelf. So I've been working with this really amazing teacher for a couple of years now, and he used our tool to create, over 2 years, he did one set of 4 reading assignments. And this one was designed to be a collaborative reading activity that he's done for years in his classroom. And he's frustrated with it because it's supposed to be discussion and they don't discuss. So we brought my robot in to try to help alleviate that problem. So we took this microbes and meningitis and 3 other articles. And what he did was, oh, I'm sorry, actually, this is for the second study. But he took these science-related articles. And what he did the first time around was he just pulled out the discussion questions he used in the past, and he just started to paste them in there. And then he would play them and listen to them and be like, oh, that sounds weird. So we'd edit them a little bit, but mostly just to make them more socially appropriate to be said out loud, as opposed to just a question on a sheet. So we studied this, and and the big takeaway here, and a lot of teachers told us in code design, is they weren't super worried about whether kids are getting the right answers. They really just wanted them to think and to build on each other's ideas in this discussion. So we've set up 2 different studies of this. The first one we did in the classroom, where 2 or 3 students would be in a group. They'd get the article. In one condition, the robot would read those questions to them. In the other condition, they got the old-fashioned sheet of paper discussion questions. Now, as you might suspect, if you haven't been in a middle school classroom, the paper version, they read the article, and then they did the divide and conquer. All right, I got number 1, you do number 2, you do number 3, and they literally just passed the paper around. And the conversation was solely about, oh, I found it here. Oh, I'm going to write this. And they went right to the text to try to extract answers from text, pull them out, put them on the paper, and it was a divide and conquer sort of approach. When the robot did that, the facilitation, that's when they actually had these discussions. So I'm going to give you a good example. The robot said, what is rot? And one kid says, oh, rot. Another kid jumps in and says, decomposition. Third kid says, rot is like when something, and now we're getting that magic, like completing each other's sentences kind of stuff, breaks down. Yeah, like it starts to break down a lot. like if I left this pencil here, and then 20 years later, it would just be a pile of mulch. Now, the other kid, G5, does not like this idea of mulch. So jumps in and says, well, not really mulch, because mulch, and G4 says, well, right, mulch, but like broken down wood. And so you can, this is like classic learning sciences, like coming together on this agreed understanding. And this never even came close to happening without a robot facilitator. The robot was there, it did. Again, I think it's about this mental model. Robot proposed this social dynamic to it that shifted the paradigm of the work they were doing. Because these students are so used to what this activity is that it's hard to break out of it. They did activity as usual. When the robot was there, it shaped and reformed the way they thought was happening. So during the in-class discussions, we saw it really commonly. The robot there helped students build answers together and included ideas outside of the text, whereas just the paper-based one, it was pretty boring to watch. Those are terrible transcripts to go through. So in the second study, this we designed more as a homework activity. And by now, the teacher really saw the potential for the robot, so it added a lot more of those emotional expression and personal connection making that the robot might say. So there was a lot of questions involved, but there was also a lot of statements that came from the robot. And what we found, and again, in HRI, this is a settled thing. And it's a little frustrating because when we propose comparing a robot to a robot on the screen, so many HRI researchers will be like, oh, we already know, the in-person robot's better. Well, I don't know, because what I'm finding is that the outcomes of these things, they prefer the in-person, but their responses were pretty similar. And I think in this activity, students know how to read an article and answer a question. And the robot was social enough, even on the screen, to get that verbal answer to come out. And they were thoughtful about these answers. It was pretty rare for them to go and find the answer in the article. They just sort of said what they thought the answer was. And that was about the same in both of those cases. So similar to that gesturing one, right? That social presence, we pulled it back, but just enough social presence in there still makes the thing go. So what's interesting about this part was in here, when we got this discussion to go, we're like, well, how are we going to get that? The robot cannot have this conversation. How do we get them to elaborate? We tried very fancy things that didn't work. And by the time we got to the deadline to have to roll this thing out, we just came up with a simple, would you like to add more? And so I want to show you what that looks like when it goes well.
Can you imagine how that feels?
Probably feels like someone getting poison ivy on them and they keep scratching it.
Any additional thoughts you'd like to share? Would you like to continue with your
It'll probably get worse and worse the more that they pick at it, and it'll probably be hard to not pick at it, so.
Is there something else you'd like to say about this?
No.
That's great. Yeah. Well, it's great when it worked. But most of the time, the robot say, anything else you'd like to add? And the kid be like, no. So this was kind of best case scenario. But right, when I saw it happen, I was like, yes, that's what we
Not
built.
always, right? But it doesn't work.
So I'm really grappling with this idea about how do we get that mental model to build the expectation that when the robot says, do you have more to add, that I should add, right? It's like when you go to the grocery store or something and the person behind the counter goes like, hey, how you doing? The number of times you even answer that is not 100%, right? It's like, or just, like without thinking about it, oh, fine, how are you? And, we're not actually listening for answers because our mental model has that as not a real question. So right now, most of the time, the kid did not see this as something they were compelled to respond. So to me, there's this design thing happening. How do we make that happen? Because when it does, awesome. So this is a demonstration about the same thing. I think we're going to run low on time, so I'm going to skip this. But in the computer condition, the few times it did pop up, same thing. So just a little bit of social presence is all it took to get them to do a little bit of this. If the design isn't there to get it to happen.
Can you?
The big thing that I'm taking away from this is that, let me frame this a little bit by saying, kids really liked when the robot said, this was scary, or I don't like that, or could you, I can imagine how that feels. The robot was, trying to make personal connections. They felt that was the robot contributing ideas to what's happening. love that. But in this asking the question, this is the takeaway that was the disconnect here. So this kid told us that it's like the robot asks, do I want to add more, like give more suggestions, but it doesn't add any itself. And that's that disconnect. So if the robot's not going to do it, why should I? It seems to be the thing. So I prefer that I add some stuff too, because when I work with a partner, they also add ideas that I may not want. So there's this foundation. Kids do want to do that building. I just haven't figured out how to support it yet. Partly from a technological limitation space, because I'm not fully ready to just roll an LLM out in front of kids. So we can only say like, hey, do you want to add more? And the kids say, no. Okay. Other little thing I'll add in here too that came out of this study was the one group did this in a library, like an after-school homework club. And that really seemed to influence them because they felt a little self-conscious about being in a library and talking. And so we hadn't really quite anticipated that. We knew this was a homework club. We didn't know that it was going to be in the library until kind of too late. So that really kind of happened here. And again, sort of a small aside, tells you that there's something happening in the mental model. Like I'm in a library, I'm supposed to be quiet. And there's robots like you should talk, and there's a disconnect there. Okay, so let's try to frame this. And this is the part I told you. It's a rickety framework. So be careful. I'm just going to focus on some of the things that I think are most have the most mechanical grip right now. So I told you that I'm really thinking about how context clues from the environment and the activity, social cues from the robot are making this mental model formation. And that's going to inform what the learner is supposed to do with the robot supposed to do. What happens in this activity. So let's try to break this down a little bit. From an environmental cue perspective, we're going to ignore some of the mess. And I really want to highlight, this is the part I've been gravitating to a lot lately, is that we see learners having this role of reading in home with the robots, that they read and talk out loud, that's what they're supposed to do. But they're also okay engaging with other family members. When a family member tried to jump in, there was no cases where the kid would say, no, no, I'm talking with the robot, you stay out of this. They always engage that. So they're ready for that part. And I think we can run with that. And they also included the family, like family members and personal items, things around their house were part of some of these reading activities. We had kids dressing the robot up. One of them had like a Halloween costume that was with the little yellow guys, one eyes.
Minions.
Minions, yes. One of them dressed the robot up like a minion. And so that's how she had to do this. But again, if your mental model is this is like some rigid, I shouldn't mess with the technology, you'd never dress it up. So there's some personal side that's happening there. How can we embrace that? So that if this is what the mental models are, how can we design things that really engage and fit that mental model? So that's what some of the cues happening from the home are. From the activity, one of the things I've been really interested in is that activity I showed you with the quarters, is that the robot didn't really seem aware of what was happening, right? It said, let's do this together. But at that point, I didn't do any sort of tracking of the activity space at all, or really suggest a way that the robot might take place. It just said, let's do it together. They didn't seem to have any role for the robot. But if another study that I've done, where we actually have the person, or the robot tells them that they're going to collaborate and build ideas together, then they do actually, the person will manipulate the materials and actually show, is that this next one? I have it coming up a little bit. Actually show those materials to the robot a lot of times. So their job is to be, right, they're collaborating, but part of the learner's role is to be the one handling the objects. But the robot does have a role to be interactive and to suggest and to confirm the ideas. So that's where it worked. The awareness of the robot and the specific role for the robot helped frame this, as opposed to unawareness that we have anything. So those are the design of the activity cues really kind of helped shape that. And then I think the robot's cues, that follow-up question bit's really just stuck with me because I didn't get it right. I don't like being unsuccessful at things. So when we just asked, hey, do you want to follow up? The robot didn't really seem compelling to have that follow-up. So how can we get this robot's role to actually feel like it's listening to you in a way that, right? Like if somebody asks you a follow-up question and you're, especially routinely, and you're just like, no, no, no. You, at some point, you kind of feel social pressure to answer, right? Like, so how do we get to that where you feel that the robot has this role? Right now, that doesn't seem to be the case. So let me tell you a little bit about what I'm doing with these ideas. One big takeaway is this idea that mental models include this natural inclination to engage with others in the home. We're seeing that. So I'm really thinking about how do we design robots to encourage and facilitate that thing, bring parents into the conversation intentionally. How do we integrate that without disrupting robots into family life? So I do have a little focus paper on what that framing might look like and how we should go about and do that. And I'm hoping that a study we're planning for next year is going to be able to do some of these things, particularly the parent involvement. How do you get parents to be involved in like a homework activity that balances the parent not having to do all the work, but also feeling that they have a space there? How do you make that an inviting thing? That really should come from the design. Another one is that mental models seem to exclude the robot from physical activities in many cases, particularly the robots I use. I don't have a now, and even if I do have a now, they have little hands that can pinch. Those things, they're useless. They don't do anything. Anybody ever try to get a now robot to pick something up? It's awful. I spent 2 months trying to get it just to pick up one little marshmallow. So how do we actually design manipulative activities that align with those robot affordances in ways that might be more compelling to have the person involved in the robot? So the quarter and the ruler thing didn't seem to do that, but we had a gift basket and people putting things into the gift basket. That seemed to get me to confirm with the robot before. So this is kind of a little bit of what that looks like. With these gift baskets, they're choosing which items to put in there. And a lot of times they would say, well, I'm thinking about this or this, and show it to the robot. And so the shape and the space here really did seem to include the robot more in that. And just the nature of the activity. All right, takeaway number 3. Mental models frame the robot as a listener and a companion. This is so common. It's like the most basic thing we can get from kids. Robot feels like a companion. So how do we design the robot to feel more like a collaborative partner rather than just this sounding board? Like my ideas go out, and sometimes the robot's ideas come in, that externalizing, internalizing. How do we get that building thing? And I see some evidence of where that can happen, but I think there's more design to be done there. Mental models have students slow down and feel less anxiety. How do we leverage that better for learning? One of the things we did was put together a study. This is collaboration with the University of Chicago. Lauren Wright is an amazing doc student there. I've had this idea forever, and she ran with it. And we have really great biometrics that show when a child is reading to a person, particularly when they make a mistake, they have these little anxiety spikes. So vocal jitter, it's a heart rate fluctuation measure that we use in there. And when they do the same thing in front of a robot, it doesn't happen. So I'm very much don't replace people, but maybe sometimes, like in a diagnostic where we're trying to get at the reading comprehension for these kids, maybe if we can take the anxiety out of it by putting a robot there, we still get the social bit where they're reading out loud and have that part, but we take that ego protection part out of the play, and that might actually be a better diagnostic. So kind of working on those ideas about where is it use this benefit to our advantage. And so, yeah, with that, like I said, this is a whole hodgepodge of my ideas and things I've seen. I really do want to appreciate Mitch Nathan, who's been such a foundational figure and idea generator for me. Bill Gay and Sarah are my collaborators at Wisconsin and University of Chicago. Middle row there are some of my grad students, Robbie and Paul, and Elise, and some of the grad students of my collaborators, Michael, Bengisu, and Timmy, who've just been amazing people to work with, and I wouldn't be able to talk about all this stuff without so many hours and thoughts from all these people. This QR will get you to my lab website if you want to get any more of those things. If you are of the Blue Sky social media persuasion, you can find me there where I mostly just complain about viewers. And that's all I got. So please hit me with some questions and ideas, and thank you for listening.
It's really a lot of interesting ideas. Thanks a lot for presenting such an overview. Since I was a part of the old generation of work when it was embodied agents on the screen, like cats and dogs and people, if you remember when Microsoft started playing the game, so there was a lot of similar research, and it shows basically in the lab, you can show a lot of cool things. But then when you try to use it in the real situation, basically the novice effect mostly faded, but not completely. So are there any studies with real robots which try to basically separate that the original new thing in the end, which is very well known, from actual lasting value in the long-term research? It looks like, at least at home, you might have done long scale research, like observing student for like half a year, a semester? Maybe not your research, but
Yeah. So mine, I've done 2 weeks, and the novelty effect was a 1 day massive spike. And then we saw reading engagement and interest drop. But it leveled off pretty quickly.
right, but it's not drop to zero, right?
Exactly, yeah. And in that one, HRI researchers talk about that. There's a real casualty of high expectations with a high novelty effect on the first one. And that's what we saw, is if you had really high situational interest to begin with, you bottomed out because it didn't meet the expectations. After 2 weeks, it does start to dip a little bit more. And so what we're trying to work on now for the longer, I think just a reading activity isn't sufficient enough. We need to integrate, and that's the articles that I have. We need to design these things to integrate more within family life. So instead of this extra reading activity, it needs to be a thing that meets what parents and families are already doing. So that's kind of, we're trying to rely on some of the technology adoption model where people sort of identify with the technology, they find it integrated into their lives. So that's kind of the approach, because I think we can sustain some of the learning activities by integrating within bigger areas of it. That's what we're trying to test out. And we're hoping to do, I want to do a year. My colleagues are like, maybe 6 months is enough. So 6 months is it's a lot. So yeah, I'm hoping we can at least get like a family or two that we can just push it as long as they're able to go. So absolutely on my mind. And the novelty effect is real, but I think you're right. Still with these robots, it'll drop, but not as precipitously as
This is really interesting. It's outside of my research area. But so I found it interesting that you said that when these kids were interacting with the robot, they experienced less anxiety. I had a question about the interaction. Was the robot ever correcting them if they made mistakes, or was it?
Yeah, in this study, the design is there's this reading diagnostic. When they mispronounce a word, the person will have them go back and say it again. And so we did that. The robot, it actually worked with the listener here, actually worked well amazing. So it would identify when it was mispronounced. And so they would have them go back and say that specific word, up to 3 words in the reading. And if they didn't make any mistakes, both the robot and the person were trained to have them just pick the 3 hardest words we knew in that passage and have them. So yeah, so they would not say you got it wrong, but they would say, hey, can you say this again? But
and how did the humans say that? They say, oh, you pronounced that wrong. Or did they?
No, and it's part of the diagnostic. Oh. To say as they're reading, you wait to the end, you know which ones they said wrong. You say, could you repeat this word for me? But you actually didn't need the person to tell them wrong. The kids knew. And so you could sort of see these fluctuations. When they made mistakes, it wasn't because I said you're wrong. It's because you felt you were wrong, and I'm there watching you be wrong, and now everybody's embarrassed. And that embarrassment part didn't happen. But they knew when they were wrong. And again, kids reading at home, they tell us all the time, I'm reading along, I mispronounce a word, and my mom is like, it's pronounced this way. They didn't want that. They just wanted to be able to read. So they liked that the robot didn't jump.
Talk. You mentioned that the robotic gesture that help the children learn that to automatically conjecture. I want to guideline your insights on the multi-model communication that help the children to learn.
How about the gesture? Yeah, I mean, there's a whole Mitch has a whole book on this. But yeah, that's the idea, is that by using gesture, we're activating parts of our mental model that we're simulating and manipulating our understanding. And in doing so, that helps us reason about it. And when we don't, we're actually less likely to be doing the type of reasoning that's going to help us get to the answer. So that's kind of the short reason that this should work. But generally, gesturing is thought to be beneficial to cognitive activity. Richard was trying to get this IRB through, where he wanted to test that. He wanted to test if we limited and inhibited people's gestures. There's a lot of evidence that if you can't use your hands, your thinking slows down. Your cognitive processing slows. So we wanted to have people. We were going to have these like gloves on the table, and you have to like put your hands in the gloves so you can gesture. IRB was like, "What if there's a fire?" And so we were having to do these like Velcro it so that if it was on fire, they could de-Velcro themselves. So yeah, so there's a lot of evidence behind the role of gesture in thinking. And from my perspective, it also is this window into your mental model and manipulating it that helps me understand something.
Those gestures. I mean, like, how do you decide what kind of gesture should the robot use?
Yeah, that's a wall that research area has hit, because there's sometimes we can identify these beneficial gestures, but they're really idiosyncratic. You can do a triangle like this, or like this, or like this, or you can draw it. So the right gesture, we haven't found that for the most part. There's some that are beneficial, but it doesn't mean it's the gesture. It just means it's a good one. Yeah, and so Mitch ends up sort of falling back to the like just more gestures is better. That's what we need.
So the activity regarding this and of the earlier activity when kids seem to be more comfortable talking to robots or responding to robots, they're prompt to do discussions and so. Is it because they think, well, I have a conjecture. Do you think because the kids consider robots as their peers instead of their parents? Because everything you've been comparing to, you're letting the kids to talking to, or like on the opposite side, it's either a teacher or professional, it's an adult sitting there. If there's no adult there, like if we could have an experiment with another kids, but doing the similar thing as the adult.
So this, but instead of this being an adult, like, is this another kid you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Or like in a group activity where you're in a group, you're just looking for that leader as the same peer as the leader, but they can do that. They can do the prompting, or they can do this, discuss something.
The peer effect is also pretty strong.
Would that make would that affect, or is it because they think the robots are their peers, or they think the robots are someone else?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think I ask this question a lot of times. Do you think this is more like a teacher or a parent or a peer or tutor? A lot of times they say tutor. There's really interesting answers that like, well, it's a tutor because it's like a teacher, but it can't give me the answer and isn't going to like push this side of it. So they see it as this kind of like chill teacher. Not as often as a peer. In the reading, just pure pleasure reading activities, then it does come more of a peer. But I think that it's even a step further back, because there is a peer effect there too. There's some work Brian Reiser's doing now at Northwestern, where they're trying to actually get those quieter students in groups to say more ideas and to get group members to talk about ideas that aren't the obvious right choice. That you have to take a little more risk taking to put those ideas out into your group. And the theory there is that it's just intimidating to say something that seems like a crazy idea in groups sometimes. So I think the robot is one social step further removed from a peer, but it can play these roles like a tutor. So you get a little bit of both.
And follow-up, if the robot becomes more socially active, interactive with the kids, do you think the mental model of kids of that specific robot will change from?
It might, yeah. I haven't been able to test that, but we do know the more human-like, even presentation the robot has, expectations go way up. So if it starts engaging in back and forth conversation, then yeah, maybe that does draw it out of that social other category and closer into more socially capable. Because maybe now if my mental model changes, like, oh my God, the robot was able to build that on what I said. What else is it thinking, right? Is it judging my response? Maybe that does, I hadn't thought of that, but maybe it does come into play as it gets a little more sophisticated in interaction.
Going in the similar directions of the robots' roles. So were in any of the studies, any of the roles were externalized, like in the task itself or something? Like, did you tell them the robots that role or something? I'm coming into this direction based on one of the examples that you showed, that the a participant said that I usually expect my partner to talk to me and give me opinions rather than just asking me questions. So was that partner like a perceived thing, or was that as a part of the activity? Like,
no, that would have been more of a perceived thing. So we do generally frame In that study, we actually didn't do much framing about what the robot's there to do. We would just say the robot's here to work with you on this activity. Kind of left it. In other ones, we've had the robot say, I'm a reading coach. We framed it as like, I'm a reading coach in training, so I'm here to practice kind of thing. So that might have influenced the expectations a little bit there too. The collaborative one with the gift basket stuff, the robot did say, like, I'm here to help you do this activity together. So yeah, we do a lot of kind of putting our thumb on the scale about how people interact by giving them pretty explicit roles for the robots. But that's what's interesting to me is that all these things pop up anyway, even though we try to channel them down. Yeah, well, thank you all. I really appreciate how engaging. Like I said, my little HRI world can feel so small, so it's awesome to see other people connecting things and ideas about it. Thank you all for having me.
Kind of a broad question.
Yeah.
So one of the things we see with this is that when the children, like students, learn this kind of modality, there's more connection with the whole process of learning. But with this idea that we are using LLMs, which is more computerized and we just kind of
Also, without
work
the
with
robotic
the,
agent, you have
yeah, there is no like
generative AI.
That's a different kind of modality. There's this whole line of thinking that there's a disconnect between who you talk with outside of the computer. So I think one of the things in your framework was that they still continue conversations with their family while interacting with the bot.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that? What is your answer from an HRI perspective for this question that people are saying like AI psychosis and those thoughts that when you kind of get so involved with the LLMs reaction responses that
that's a really interesting thought.
That you kind of lose the reality.
Yeah, right.
And then kind of
I wonder because in the LLM,
but that's actually one of the things I've been wondering myself because
Yeah.
we have this idea of robotic people interacting with robots. There's that whole social aspect of it, which we completely ignore when we just consider a computer and then there's an AI agent.
I wonder if there's something happening where there's this like, because like a robot enters the social stage in that space, it says stuff out loud that you see. With an LLM, like it's just you like.
Yeah, exactly. So there is some modality aspect.
Yeah, right. So my suspicion would be that you sort of it's another place, right? And maybe some of the similar issues that happen with like social media stuff too. People just go down on social media.
Yeah, but the thing with
pulls you, whereas the robot you have to interact within that social space, so it changes.
Yeah, so then suggestion is to move away from like an agent where it's just embedded in a system, like a laptop or tablet.
I think so. Yeah, every reviewer I've ever had in my entire life says, well, why don't we just put it on a computer? It's cheaper. And I think there's so many advantages to that in-person part. And one of them is that it presents within your own social space and connects into that space, as opposed to being this whole other. I think there's a huge benefit to it.
And another angle that I thought of during your talk was also this idea of spatial computing that's growing. So if we don't directly use a physical robot, but it's through VR or AR, and you interact with that bot, but you still are kind of with your environment.
Yeah.
So
that's a great question. I mean, it's in between my experience with VR, it does feel like you're switching to somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly.
And so
no, but these days AR has actually improved a lot.
Oh, you can
like
so augmented.
Yeah,
maybe, right? Again, to me, what seems responsible, if we're trying to like preserve the social nature of humanity, is to bring these technologies into the social space as a shared space. Yeah. So if augmented, that's a design. If your AR gets their heads up and sees things other people are seeing, you can share. The audio part would be another thing, right? Sometimes those have audio right in your ear, you don't use it. That produces it. So I don't know.
Is that something
we can have audio out for everybody? I don't know.
Is that something you can pitch to these companies that focus more on just building this one modality and AI?
No, because a good way to make money is to separate the product from reality so you can get them in that wormhole and keep them engaged. Yeah, that's why AI is so sycophantic because people engage with people who are flat. So, I'm gonna, oh my God, I love your research. Your shirt's great. Oh my God, you'll keep talking to me. Yeah. So if I pull you out of that other space, I can keep you in my space and then presumably throw ads in. So for companies, no, I don't think they want to hear that. Great. But for people who care about society. So cool, yeah, great idea. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I have two questions.
Yeah.
I don't work on this area, so maybe my question cannot be simple. So
sure. Yeah.
I'm curious how the mental model is trained or is established. So I saw that it's like a generative model, but I don't know.
From a robot perspective?
Yes.
In all kinds of ways, I think so you could think of it in like a natural language processing perspective, right? That makes sense. You can take linguistic cues to add more meaning to what people are literally saying. But in my world, what I do is also model out the activity space as well.
So is it like maybe there are three options or maybe more options? First option, okay, I have some like pre-trained model, and I fine-tune the model with a separate data set, or I create a database, knowledge database, and then I use this knowledge database for the inference, or I start training from the scratch.
Yeah, I mean, you can do any of those things in trying to create models, but so we're working on one that's like a collaborative learning activity. What we're going to do first is get a bunch of kids just to do it, so we can collect all that data and then try to build a base model off of that training set of data, where we're going to human label this happened here, this happened here, this happened here, build a model from it, and then we're going to run it again to try to fine tune that model, and then we'll do some like RAG kind of things. We're trying to introduce what's the actual content of the learning materials that they're doing. Put that in the model. Yeah, so I think to me, the best way to do it is to start at that human level, start from scratch in a sense. Can we take what humans are doing, get enough data on it to build a basic model, fine tune that so we bring teachers in the loop. So
it's like human feedback.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, so we'll have the robot then run that model with students, and then we're going to have teachers review what happened and have them go back and then label when our model interpreted the student action as this, a teacher can go back and fix those things. So you get the teacher in the loop part of that. So it's like preference. So for estimating the student state, so reinforcement model points from a human labeling, and then we're going to do preference-based learning so that when the robot does an action, do teachers agree that that was a good action to do? And so again, that's kind of the reward function is +1 for the reward, I would do that. -1 for the reward, I would do that. And then kind of iterate on that. So, but we're just starting with but for me, again, I think you really have to ground it in people. Otherwise, the machine learning person I work with, she's like, well, what's the G-star model for this? It's like, there isn't. It's your kids in classrooms, like it's a mess. You don't know. So starting with people is the right answer.
And also, second question is about, I saw that you have some like learners go, and usually they're like fixed learners go. But in my study time, for example, if I saw a very hard math problem, first I need some encouragement, and second I need some inspiration, and then I need some specific, like equations or domain knowledge. Then last, help me to check if it's correct or not. So I have so my goal involves. So can the mental model meet my requirement? Like give me different, for example, first just encourage me, but maybe at the third phase or fourth phase be very objective. Just tell me.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I haven't gotten to that level of sophistication, but you're absolutely right. They need to sort of evolve, right? In that first step, if it's a hard mental problem, the kid's mental model might be like, I think that's what you're getting at. So we need technology, the robot, to sort of shape that mental model to make them see in that problem what they can do, where they can start, right? That's the kind of motivation you need to do. And then once you've gotten to that part, then yeah, it might need to evolve. You get a little traction when you're doing the work. Now you need to shape their mental model a little bit more, particularly when they get stuck, is probably when this is happening. Okay. So yeah, absolutely. I think what it is that I'm doing here is going to evolve even during the course of it. Absolutely.
Is there any popular paper talking about this evolving?
Not within a problem itself. More long-term personalization kind of things, yes, as people like as interest develops and changes, there's some a paper, I think it's still that is done. But it's such a complex part that we barely figured out like the basic, the kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Hi. I got a slight follow-up from my question, I guess. I think you mentioned multiple times during the Q&A, if you have a too high of expectation, or if the robots like supposedly behaving too intelligent, then people's evaluation is so high. Well, from the start, my paper this year, the first effect we found, well, we're not building like the robot, but it's kind of NPC characters in games.
Okay.
And then I made those agents or bots to be able to use the same communication toolkits as usually just put a pin on that, like these type of toolkits, similar as what people would use. And then the result we found, or at least part of the thing I noticed is people get really excited. The player get really excited, and then they realize, okay, the bots are not doing anything fancy except for they're making those things.
Yeah.
And then immediately they just starting to like towards the end of the game, it's no longer working.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's a well-known effect in HRI. You have to calibrate those initial expectations because if you oversell and underperform, right, and then people will shut off. So there's a whole other outside of mental models. There's a whole other area that we're interested in. When we interact with robots, I think it's the same thing that happens in watching a movie where you suspend your disbelief, right? It's just something impossible happens on a movie screen. But as long as it's sort of internally consistent with the movie world, we have no problem with that. And the worst thing a movie can do is break its own internal consistency, and then you no longer suspend your disbelief. Now you disbelief. So the same thing happens that the robot, if it sets this initial expectation, you can do everything. You're like, yeah, I'm in, let's do it. And if it breaks that expectation, stop suspending your disbelief. And now everything the robot does is suspicious and you don't think it's actually. So it's worse to overpromise because people will just totally abandon. So yeah, that's absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess my kind of question is, do you know some of the literature, so at least I should be looking at this initially when come out, kind of, I wasn't expecting results, but then they were think of it.
Yeah, I would say email me so I can dig in. I know I have a science robotics article. That's the one where I make that point. We show the highest situational interest on day one is the lowest engagement on day 13. And so that was one of the biggest predictors of disengagement is high situational interest on day one. Okay. So I say that in a paper, but I know it's a relatively common effect. So I can okay. Thank you. You're welcome. Well, thanks.